we already discussed with Professor Ahmar Mahbub about POLI, or language acquisition device, and then in the second international scholarly engagement, we discussed about Arabic studies with Professor Helge Daniels from Belgium, and today it is our third edition of the International Scholar Engagement webinar. Today, I'm very happy to be able to accompany all of you to learn together from the expert, Dr. Rwani Tupas. Before the event starts, I ask the webinar participants to mute your Zoom microphone so that this event can run smoothly. And just for information, the webinar certificate link will be distributed by the committee at the end of the webinar event. And this webinar itself will be divided into 2 sessions. Our invited speaker, Dr. Rwani Tupas, will deliver the material for approximately 1.5 hours maybe. And after that, we will go to the Q&A, question and answer session. The participant can write question in the chat box or ask directly to the speaker by turning on the Zoom camera. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, let's open our webinar by saying Basmalah together. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Now, it is time for an opening speech or opening remark that will be given by the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, UIN Maulana Malik Ibrahim Malang, to Dr. Faisal. The screen is yours. You are most welcome, Dr. Faisal Fatawi. Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
The Honorable Keynote Speaker and all the participants of this International Scholar Engagement, on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities, I am pleased to welcome you all to participate in one of our excellent programs. We are fortunate to have Dr. Rwani Tupas from University College London today to deliver a talk on sociolinguistics from a decolonial lens. This topic is within the scope of critical applied linguistics, one of our faculty's roadmap. This topic is timely and is a critical issue for us who live in the global south. It is because through the colonial approach to knowledge, we criticize and contest the domination of the Western European mode of thought, such as universal reason and scientific rationality. Furthermore, through the decolonial approach, we want to establish knowledge which is grounded in our own knowledge system. In that context, we want to learn more about this from Dr. Rwani Tupas talk today in order for us to be more critical and confident to disrupt the Western European hegemony, as well as to prepare ourselves better to establish our knowledge and be the player for the current global knowledge production, not only the consumer. We wish you all gain critical insight from this talk, and welcome to Dr. Rwani Tupas, and thank you very much for your participation in this international school engagement. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
And now we come to the general introduction from our head of English Literature Department, Mr. Riput Wahidi, MA PhD, and he maybe want to say hi to his friend, Dr. Rwani Tupas. Mr. Riput Wahidi, the screen is yours.
Mr. Agwin Speaker.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Faisal, for your opening speech. Okay, now we turn to the next agenda, maybe some general introduction for the head of English Literature Department of UIN Malang, Dr. Ribut Wahyudi, MA, and maybe he want to say hi to his friend Dr. Wani Tupas. To Pak Ribut Wahyudi, MA PhD, the screen is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for the time, Pak Akwin. And first of all, I'd like to thank the speech previously given by our Dean, Pak Faisal, who is, where the speech itself is very critical. That nowadays we are still in critical perspective. We are still, dominated by the Western European mode of knowledge production, so that today we can learn more from, I think, Dr. Ruwani Tupas. And first of all, of course, we would like to thank the availability of the time of Dr. Ruwani Tupas. In the past time, actually, we have proposed Dr. Ruwani Tupas to be invited to talk for this faculty. But that time, Dr. Ruwani Tupas was busy, so that we need to find another speaker. And this time, we also want to thank all the participants from other universities who have committed to come and join and interested in our program. I don't want to say to make it any longer, Pak Akwin. I think I will give the screen back to you to directly listen to Dr. Ruwani Tupas talk today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Ribut Wahyudi. And now we turn to the main event, the presentation of our invited speaker. But before Dr. Ruwani Tupas give his presentation or explanation about sociolinguistics from a decolonial lens, allow me to read his curriculum vitae. Dr. Ruwani Tupas is now currently a lecturer at the Center for Applied Linguistics, Department of Communication, Culture and Media, University College London. He holds his BA and Master of Art in English Studies from the University of the Philippines in Diliman. And he earned his PhD in English Studies in 2003 from the University of Singapore. And his research interest is in language and education, bilingual or multilingual education, and politics of knowledge production. He is also an editor in various reputable international journals, such as the International Journal of the Sociology of Language, and also the Teflin Journal. For publication, yeah, maybe I don't need to tell you because he is very productive in writing articles and books or book chapters. You may visit his Google Scholar because he is a truly scholar. Some of his most cited writings include Unequal Englishes, The Politics of Englishes Today, published by Springer, and Inequalities of Multilingualism, Challenges to Mother Tongue-Based Multilingual Education, published by Routledge. Maybe that's all from his curriculum vitae. You may visit his Google Scholar because he has a lot of publication. Yeah, for only his article, he already wrote maybe 100 article for a journal publication. Okay, without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Ruwani Tupas. To Dr. Ruwani Tupas, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dega.
Yeah, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much. And Dean Faisal, as we say it in the Philippines, magandang araw, good day to you and to everybody. Thank you very, very much also through Dr. Ribut as well. I think for those of you who were around much earlier, I spoke about how I miss Malang because I've been to Malang many times. I've been to Jember to Banyuwangi, and other parts of course, Indonesia, such as Salatiga and Jakarta, and many others. So because I've had quite a number of projects, and I continue to have networks with really a lot of colleagues and friends also in Indonesia. So it's always, to me, always coming home, every time I get invited for a lecture or for a workshop. So thank you very, very much for the invitation. And it's actually quite early in the morning, so I have my coffee with me. So please forgive me if I sip my coffee from time to time. All right, so thank you. The topic that was in a sense assigned to me is something that this of course really very close to my heart. I'm a social linguist, and for those of you who are not very familiar with sociolinguistics, generally sociolinguistics is of course the study of language in society. And even within the field of sociolinguistics, we have varying areas of research as well. We have many different perspectives, many different research concerns. And there are some parts, in fact, that I am also not very familiar with as far as sociolinguistic studies are concerned, because it is by itself really a very huge field of research. But we are all bound basically by a very broad concern with the study of language in society, as opposed, of course, to the more structural linguistics, which is basically looking at language as a system, looking at language as a structure. So you describe the elements of a particular language, and in a sense try to make sense, what constitutes this system. But when you're talking about sociolinguistics, you're talking about how people use language. And when you're talking about how people use language, it's less prescriptive. It is more descriptive. When you say descriptive, we try to suspend judgment. Sociolinguistics does not basically make very straightforward, commentaries on, people's language use and say, you are doing it the wrong way or you are doing it the right way. In fact, one of those really trigger words in sociolinguistics would be words such as it is correct or it is wrong. All right, because we are not in a business of making such judgments. We are in the business of trying to understand why people speak the way they speak, why people write the way they write, because by asking that question, we bring those questions back to history, to politics, to ideology, and so on and so forth. Now, I understand that your department, your faculty, has a broad range of areas of work as well. Of course, my area would be definitely more closer to issues concerning language. All right, and many of you, I'm sure, are working along the lines of Arabic, for example. So while I do talk about English, I do talk about globalization of English, because that's basically where my expertise is, or my research area is. I'm hoping that probably later on in the question and answer, we can make correlations, between the teaching and the learning and the use of different languages as well. I may be able to make references to also the teaching, the learning of other languages, such as the Philippine languages as well, and so on and so forth. So yes, just to alert you, the focus of my presentation would be on the nature of teaching and learning and use of English, which I believe will also have parallels with the teaching and learning and use of other languages as well. So let's make such connections later on. Okay, so let me now share my screen. Okay, I hope it's everyone. It's clear to everyone, all right? Okay. Let me just see. Okay. All right. Okay, so let me then therefore start, with an introduction, because I'm going to end with this introduction later as well. All right. I can, of course, we all can introduce ourselves in different ways, but I choose to introduce myself this way to you. I am a multilingual speaker of English. All right. And I am a multilingual teacher of English. Now, I am aware, and I'm sure you are aware, that there are other ways of introducing ourselves, especially introducing ourselves as speakers of particular languages as well. But I choose to introduce myself this way. I'm a multilingual speaker of English. I am a multilingual teacher of English because it's a choice, all right? I choose it because if you notice here, when I say I am a multilingual speaker of English, I focus on the word multilingual. Why? Because I would like to emphasize the fact that my being able to speak many different languages is a positive contribution to my being a speaker of English. Why? Because by referring to myself as a multilingual teacher of English, all right, I focus on the fact that my being multilingual is not a negative, aspect of my speech, because a lot of times, especially in foreign language teaching and learning, multilingualism or the appearance of different languages in the teaching and learning and use of a foreign language is usually deemed in negative ways. But to me, and research will show this, we will be talking a little bit more about this, that actually our multilingual resources, the many different languages that we use when we speak another language, all right, are positive contributions to the study, to the learning, to the teaching, and the use of another language. And in this case, when I present myself as a speaker of English, my emphasis is that I am a multilingual speaker of English. All right. It is a choice. All right. It is a choice that I make because I would like to highlight the fact that I speak many different other languages, and that these different languages are a positive contribution to my English. Right. In the same way that when I say I am a multilingual teacher of English, right, I highlight the fact that the different languages that I speak are also positive contributions to me being a teacher of English. That when I say I'm a multilingual teacher of English, it is actually part of my professional competence that I speak many other languages when I teach English. And therefore, my different languages, my competence in these different languages is a positive, constructive contribution to the teaching of English. And I am not going to just simply let go of these that basically say, these are negative effects. They have negative effects, or they have a negative impact on the teaching of English. They have a negative impact on the learning of English. I would like to take it the other way around and basically say, no, the fact that I'm a multilingual speaker is part of who I am as a competent teacher of English. All right. So that's who I am. And I'll come back to that later on at the end of my presentation. So why did I say all of those things? First and foremost, of course, when you're talking about English, I talk I talk basically of it as a multilingual language. It's never homogeneous. It's never one. It's never homogeneous. It's never one voice. It's many different languages coming together, many different languages and accents coming together to enrich the English language. And when you see here, you have Cooper very much earlier talking about language spread. You know, it's simply the process whereby the users of a language increase, right? And I guess we all know that when you're talking about English, we're talking about the spread of English, basically. And when we are to talk about the spread, you know, a very simple understanding of what it means is that the uses of the language or the users of the language have increased. And if that happens, then somehow language spread has occurred. All right, which of course is very much, you know, a characteristic of the English language. So how did the spread happen? And I think I'd like to start off with this very simple visual understanding of the spread of the English language. Now, generally or typically, we talk about it in terms of globalization. Because of globalization, all right, the English language, all right, has spread. All right, so it's a very straightforward kind of visualization of how the spread of English has happened, has occurred in the world in recent years or in recent decades. All right, now when people, however, talk about the globalization of English in the context of it as a spread of English, all right, they're missing a very big chunk of in the equation. They're missing something very, very big in the whole equation of the globalization and the spread of the English language. And it is this: cultural mediation. All right, cultural mediation. In other words, if you look at globalization and, you know, the spread of English, all right, what has happened along the way, all right, is the role of culture, you know, impacting or having an effect on the spread of English. All right, you cannot, in other words, you cannot talk about globalization of English. You cannot talk about the spread of English without culture being part of it. All right, and here we talk about it in terms of cultural mediation. All right, mediation meaning that there's something culture comes in between, you know, in a very literal sense. All right, cultural mediation meaning that the spread of English did not happen just simply by itself. All right, the spread of English has happened alongside, you know, culture making an impact on the language itself. So alongside the spread of English, all right, you also have cultural mediation. And this is where the phenomenon of the pluralization of English, some of you probably already know this concept, but this is what happens, you know, the pluralization of English. In other words, when we talk about globalization, when we talk about spread of English, we also talk about pluralization of English. And we're talking about pluralization, meaning the, you know, English as diversifying, in other words. Why is it diversifying? Because people from different parts of the world who speak different languages, who come from different cultures, have made an impact on the language itself. And because of that, structurally, functionally, semantically, even rhetorically, all right, and even ideologically, they have introduced these ideas and these structures into English in such a way that English is no longer just simply one. All right. So when we are therefore talking about the pluralization of English, let's go back to the example, to the, hold on. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. You know, this is when kids leave for school.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. And so the process whereby the cultural uses or the cultures of users, all right, of English have transformed its structures, meanings, and functions. All right. So here we are not just simply talking about the uses and the users of English increasing, but here we're talking about uses that are cultural, users who have different cultures now making an impact on the structures and the meanings and functions of English. All right. So my point here, really, the point here, therefore, is this. Okay, let me just. There are times when things don't go very fast. Is it working there, the slides? Is it moving to the next one or no?
Yes,
it's not,
it is
right?
working. Yeah.
It's not working with me though. I cannot see it.
Yeah.
What do you
this
see now?
English is a multilingual language.
And then you have pluralization of English there.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
It doesn't go
Yeah.
to the next slide.
Yeah, except that doesn't go to the next slide. Hold on. Yes. Yeah, there you go. All right. So as you can see here, so when you're talking actually of globalization, you are not just simply talking about spread. Okay, the common way of just visualizing the the impact or the power of English is that it has spread across the world. All right, when we say that English has globalized, for example, it has not only spread, all right, it also has pluralized. So it is not correct to just simply say it has spread. If you believe that the English language has spread across the world, you also must believe that it has pluralized, right? It has diversified. In other words, I am saying this precisely because somehow along the way, especially for teachers, all right, we tend to forget that because of the globalization of English, there has also been pluralization. And because pluralization is something that usually is ignored, something that is mocked, something that is viewed as negative, in the English classroom or in the different classrooms that we have in the education system. I won't talk too much about this, but as you can see here, because of that, when we're talking about the globalization of English, it has then produced not just simply one English, but many different Englishes. All right. Jan, you have world Englishes, you have Asian Englishes, you have Philippine English. In other words, diversification means that structurally and systematically, the English language has also diversified. Now, let me introduce some of these concepts to you. So what has happened to English that it has globalized? There are many ways to capture this question. All right. Some people say what has happened to English as it has globalized is that it has, transformed into different world Englishes. And that's the reason why we have different national Englishes. Like in my case, I have Philippine English. I taught and worked and lived in Singapore for 20 years. So I'm also kind of fairly familiar with Singapore English as well. So this paradigm, this framework, is a framework of understanding, that English has transformed into different national Englishes. Now, some people use the term English as an international language, and I think this is also something very, very important to everybody. All right, because when we're talking about English as an international language, that means it has taken on cultural transformations as well. So the focus more is when you talk about English as an international language, it has taken on certain forms of culture and practices of culture associated with particular uses of English. All right. And it is here, and I think I have to say it very slowly, it is here when we're talking about English as an international language, the view through which we look at the teaching in English, the teaching and learning of English should be English not in terms of in English as a native, as a first language, and English is not as a second language, but English as also not as a foreign language, but English as an international language. Why? Because when you talk about competence in English, all right, it is actually competence in when you use in English across different cultures, across different contexts, all right? And when you're talking about English across different contexts, all right, you are no longer just simply talking about English as a first language or as a second language or a foreign language. You're talking of English as an international language, and your competence will be judged, so to speak, will be evaluated based on how you navigate these international contexts of communication. All right, so that is what the implication is of English as an international language. People also talk about English as a lingua franca, right? This is another concept that you can talk about. English as a lingua franca, meaning that while world Englishes are talking about Englishes in different parts of the world, different national Englishes, English as a lingua franca refers to the English used by people talking to one another, but whose first languages are different from one another. So they are using the English basically as a common language. And so when they come together and talk to one another, there are many different varieties and accents. There are many cultural norms that need to be taken into consideration when you're talking about it. People also talk about global Englishes, in other words. So here it encompasses practically the earlier concepts, the world Englishes, English as an international language, and English as a lingua franca. Global Englishes, meaning that we are talking here of English, the diversification of the language, both in international and national context as well. All right. But there's also, it's not very much, it's not directly, a paradigm for English language spread, but it also is part of it, which is this whole notion of translingual practices. The idea being that actually when people talk to one another in the global stage, all right, they actually have multiple languages coming together. All right, so you have translingual practices, meaning that English actually is used and spoken in the midst of your language repertoire. The English language doesn't happen alone, or is not spoken alone. It's spoken alongside many other languages as well. And that's the reason why they call it translingual practices. And this is where Braj Kachru began with what English is by saying that no, actually English is an Asian language. It's not a foreign language. English is an Asian language. All right. And I think that's a very big shift in terms of thinking about English in Asia. All right, that English is no longer something like foreign to us. It's something that is already an Asian language. Because when we actually, back in the Southeast Asia, when I go and visit, I mentioned this, when I visit, let's say, Indonesia, when I visited Vietnam so many times as well for different projects too, all of us all come together and use English. All right, all Asian speakers of English, we all come together and use the English language. So it is somehow, it's increasingly difficult to just simply think of English as something that is foreign when we use it to actually communicate with one another, even within our own region. All right, and this is, I think, where Braj Kachru makes a lot of sense in saying that no, English is no longer a foreign language to Asians. English is now an Asian language. It's part of our linguistic repertoire. Okay, and this is a Filipino poet, Hemino Abad, all right, also basically making similar claims and saying something like, we also have colonized the English language. All right, we have thought of English as something that has colonized us, colonized our minds, colonized our practices, our ideologies, even the way our own approaches and so on. But, we also have done something to English because of the cultural mediation, because of the cultural mediation of in the spread of English, that means speakers of English from different parts of the world have also made an impact on the language itself. So they have also transformed the language, and therefore have also colonized the English language, because they have also changed it. So, and this is where Chinua Achebe in 1975, very, very early on, basically saying, and I quote, "I feel that the English language will be able to carry the weight of my African experience, but it will have to be a new English, still in communion with its ancestral home, but altered to suit its new African surroundings." In other words, all right, the English language cannot just simply be absolutely viewed as something completely colonial. It can already carry the weight of our experience, our African experience, our Asian experience, but in doing so, it will be a new English. In other words, it's a different English, different Englishes, and so on and so forth. And then you have, therefore, Henry Riddleson also making similar claims, and therefore, in this case, basically saying no one has exclusive rights to the language. No one has exclusive rights to the language. Anyone who speaks it has the right to own it. And this is, I think, where our entry point to talking about decolonizing the English language and decolonizing sociolinguistics and decolonizing the study, the teaching, the learning, and the use of English, all right, by basically assuming, making that assumption that no one now has exclusive rights to the language. We all have a right to own it if we use it as part of our linguistic repertoire. So the English language is deeply embedded, in other words, in the multilingual and multicultural lives of its speakers, all right? So who are then the native speakers of English today, all right? So this is what you call, this is Adrian Holiday, all right, who introduces also the term native speakerism, all right? The English language is deeply embedded in the multilingual and multicultural lives of its speakers. So the traditional notion of the native speaker as the sole authority of English language use is problematic, all right? And let me say this, the traditional notion of the native speaker as the sole authority of English language use is problematic. Why? Because, again, if the English language has spread, if the English language has globalized, if the English language has pluralized and people have taken on and taken ownership over the English language, then that means they also have, made their mark on English as well. Now, native speakerism is a term I think that we may want to use. Native speakerism is this whole ideology that everything about the use of English, everything about the teaching of English, everything about the learning of English, if it is the so-called native speaker, the native speaker is always superior. All right. But you see, if you look at the research on native speakers, let's say, for example, among teachers of English, all right, being a native speaker has not been found to be crucial or the core aspect of competence in the teaching of English. And yet we all assume that, when a native speaker is the one teaching, it's always this particular person who is better at teaching of English. All right. What research has shown is that it's more than native speakers. It's more than the question of whether you are a native speaker or non-native speaker. When you're talking about competence in the teaching of English, it's beyond that. It's competence in terms of your professional experience, competence in terms of your awareness of the cultural norms of your classrooms and your students, your commitment to teaching, for example. All of these things have something to do with your expertise as an English teacher, or as a teacher for that matter. Has nothing to do with being a native speaker. All right. And yet there's always this feeling, all right, that a native speaker is always a better teacher or a better speaker. All right. And here, that's why I share with you two among the many fallacies of Robert Phillipson. You know, we took it from a book in 1992. Number one, that when you talk about English, English is best taught monolingually, meaning if you teach English, only use English. That's a fallacy according to Phillipson, because it doesn't show, research hasn't shown it that way. All right, the role of multilingualism, the role of many different languages in the learning, not just actually of English, in the learning of science, the learning of math, and so on and so forth. All of these have been shown by research to be effective, rather just simply, working monolingually. This is what Phillipson calls the monolingual fallacy. And this is another fallacy, that the ideal teacher is a native speaker. This is what is also referred to by Phillipson as the native speaker fallacy. It is fallacious. It is not true. It's not empirically proven that the ideal teacher is a native speaker. It's as simple as that. But, we all operate along these lines. Sadly, many of us in Asia, in many different institutions, I'm afraid we all operate by this whole idea that the ideal teacher of English is a native speaker. All right. We'll talk a little bit more about this if you have questions. But then, of course, as you can see here, I also introduced my whole notion of unequal Englishes, basically saying that, yes, English language is diversified, but precisely because of issues such as native speakerism, for example, issues of the politics of the English language. The different Englishes are never equal. Those that are considered non-standard are always looked down upon. And we the so-called non-native speakers are being looked down upon as not competent teachers of English, or not competent speakers of the English language. All right. So it's never equal in the real world, in other words. Now, I won't talk about many of these examples, but I just would like to introduce you to two important concepts, therefore. All right. Here you have the concept of additive. All right. Additive bilingualism, additive multilingualism. What do you mean by additive? All right. Additive meaning that when we teach a language, and I think any language for that matter, right? When we teach a language, and any language for that matter, we have to go for, or we have to ask ourselves, is it additive pedagogy that we are subscribing to, or is it subtractive pedagogy? All right. Additive meaning that, for example, when I teach English, all right, my pedagogy should be that English is addition to what my students already have. All right. Addition to the many languages that my students already have. Now, the problem with classroom practice is that when we teach a new language, we assume that we need to tell our students to let go of the other languages. All right. We tell our students to, it's not good for you to be able to speak these other languages. You have to forget these. You have to forget these accents. All you have to do is only just the simple standard English or standard accent, and so on and so forth. But no, it has to be more oriented towards additive pedagogy, meaning that whatever it is that you teach, whatever new thing that you teach, all right, it has to be in addition to what your students already have, instead of replacing what they have and then bringing in the other, because that becomes subtractive, that becomes destructive, in other words, pedagogy. All right. And part of this, perhaps if you're interested in this concept, I'll be able to talk about this later on, is what they call translanguaging pedagogy. In other words, it's bringing back multilingualism into our classroom. It's bringing back, the other languages in the classroom, and being able to make them useful in order to teach, whatever it is that we need to teach in the classroom. So What are these very simple statements that I think I've somehow gave some kind of like a theoretical, a brief theoretical background to the implications, for example, of globalization of English. But let's pin these down further. What are these statements and these beliefs, that circulate in our daily lives? For example, when you're talking about the coloniality of our beliefs. Number one, that if you speak English, you're smart. All right. It's no. All right. Why do people go by this whole idea? All right, that the use or the fluency in a particular language, such as, for example, a global language such as English, is associated with, high intelligence, for example. But this is something like a carryover through generations and generations of education, that, when you speak a particular language, then some people think that you are in a much better position intellectually. All right. I think this is something that needs to be addressed. This is something that needs to be questioned and problematized, because this is destructive, in other words, in the way we engage in intercultural communication with different people around the world. All right. Now, you might say, no one actually thinks that way. But actually, no, in research, there has been research, let's say people, students or respondents being asked to listen to certain accents, okay? Listen to certain accents, all right? Some associate certain accents with credibility. Some would say, oh, these are really good accent. This person knows the truth, has the facts. In other words, people believe other people just by certain accents that they produce, even if they don't actually get to see it. You see? So it's not like something like, I just came up and say, this is something that that is not really true. But actually in research, it's the same thing. All right. In research, it shows really that a lot of people associate intelligence with certain languages, associate intelligence with certain varieties of English, such as the standard English, for example. And this is where I come in, all right? One, coloniality, all right? And I think this is something that I think we all probably must be able to, give it a pause. That actually, when we say, I am a non-native speaker of English, all right? I am a non-native speaker of English. It is actually a colonial belief, part of a colonial belief system. If you notice earlier, all right, when I introduced myself as a multilingual speaker of English, it was a choice not to use I am a non-native speaker of English. The reason being that there is a choice. We have a choice. Because the moment I say I am a non-native speaker of English, right? Non-native has, indexes or means certain things that are usually associated with something very negative. All right. Think of it this way. I am a non-native speaker of English. In other words, your identity as a speaker of English, your identity is based on who you are not. I am not a native speaker of English. That is basically what that sentence is saying. I am not. So your identity, who you are, is who you are not. All right. So that is a choice that we have made, that we have been asked and we have been made to believe that is true to us. And that explains why I started by saying I am a multilingual speaker of English, because by focusing more on my being multilingual, I am focusing on the positive contributions of my different languages and my different accents to the speaking and to the teaching and to the learning of English. It is the same way with I am a non-native speaker of English, or I am a non-native teacher of English. So when you actually introduce yourselves as a non-native teacher of English, you are in a sense also saying, I am not a native speaker of English. So your identity is again being negatively constructed based on who you are not. All right. So the point here really is that we have a choice as to how we present ourselves as speakers and as teachers of English. That is a choice, but we never were given that choice. But we actually have a choice because there are what we are, who we are, the multilingualism that we have, that we possess, are actually all have positive contributions to our teaching. It's the same thing, you know. I think in so many different conferences, it happens this way. When you say, I'm sorry for my bad English, all right? Why do we have to say sorry for a bad English, for example? All right. When perhaps the most important thing at the end of it all is the content of our speech, you know, positive contributions, great insight to, you know, the production of knowledge. But I think it's also because we have been taught, you know, colonial education in different parts of the world, and even global coloniality now, textbooks, even workshops, all have contributed to this whole idea of self-representation of ourselves in such a way that we begin to really mock and devalue ourselves as speakers. And that's the reason why there's always this whole idea of starting our introduction or starting our speeches by being apologetic to everybody about our bad English. Again, that is also a choice. One other, this whole idea of local languages, you know, as inferior languages. You know, since we operate on this whole idea that, you know, the local languages that we speak, all right, are inferior, are not as good as those that are, you know, school languages, basically. And the moment we do not realize this, and the moment that we begin to internalize these, all right, we begin to look at our own languages, therefore, in very negative ways, all right? And it's easier, therefore, to just simply say, yo, let's let go of these languages. It's okay not to study them. It's okay to set them aside. It's okay to erase them from the educational system. It's okay to do away with them. Why? Because deep inside us, there is an internal colonization going on, which is to believe in the fact that whatever we have, the cultural resources that we have in our communities, including the local languages that we have, the repertoires that we have in communication, that we internally realize and we internally believe that they are not as good. They are not as, you know, as of good quality, and therefore are indispensable, are dispensable, in other words. And here's another thing, all right? In second language acquisition, since I think many decades ago, there's always this whole idea that L1, meaning the first language, that interferes in L2 learning. All right, L1 interferes in L2 learning. Look at the term interfere. All right, look at the term interfere. Why do we use the word interfere when we're talking about L1 in L2 learning? All right, why do we use the word interfere? Because interfere is negative. Somehow there's something wrong with our first languages. Somehow there's something wrong with our first, you know, with our mother tongues, for example. Something wrong because they interfere in the study of the second language. All right. So you see how even our own respective disciplines actually frame, you know, negatively our own multilingualism. Again, as what I said, we actually have a choice. We actually can choose to talk about L1 use in L2 learning. For example, I can say our L1 shapes L2 learning. You see, or our L1 has an impact on L2 learning. Our L1 has an effect on L2 learning. You see, it basically acknowledges the fact that our L1 has something to do with L2 learning, the learning of a second language, the learning of another language. But it is not negatively framed. In the same, it does not negatively frame our mother tongues or our first languages in the same way that when we use interfere, all right, automatically we already somehow feel that our first languages are bad, that there's something wrong with multilingualism, that there's something wrong with our mother tongues and so on. So you see, even choices of certain words actually frame, you know, our understanding of teaching and learning and use of languages. So language beliefs, of course, you know, these are circulating in their own respective professions, even at home, even among our friends. They circulate in our offices, for example, or institutions. They actually constitute a network of ideology. And here what Bartolome in 2004 is important in talking about language beliefs or these beliefs as constitutive of ideology. Ideology is basically a framework of thought. Okay, it's a framework of thought that has been constructed held by, you know, certain members of the society to justify or rationalize an existing social order. So when you're talking about language beliefs, they are not just simply like statements here, statements there, statements here, statements there. They come together and constitute and come together as a particular body of thought, a framework of thought. So earlier we talked about, you know, many colonial beliefs, right? That, you know, L1 interferes, for example, that there's no place for first languages in the classroom, for example, that we are non-native speakers rather than multilingual speakers. All of these language beliefs and statements constitute an ideology, and that is the ideology of that we refer to as monolingualist and deficit language ideology. All right. When you say deficit, in other words, it is pedagogy. And here I'm not just simply talking of English alone, all right, but pedagogy in general, all right, that there is such a thing as pedagogy that is usually framed in deficit terms. In other words, what our students know, what our students bring along with them into the classroom, what our students have brought together in this room, that kind of a deficit pedagogy looks at all of them in very disadvantageous way. In other words, they are not important. In other words, it's okay to forget them. In other words, they are useless. They are not really very important in the education system, in classroom, in pedagogy. That is the kind of pedagogy that we have in mind when we're talking about deficit language, monolingualist deficit language ideology. All right. So many teachers do not admit to it. All right. Many teachers do not admit to it, but actually a lot of our pedagogy is deficit. So no, I may need to emphasize this. In other words, it's pedagogy that looks down on local languages, that looks down on our own cultures. All right. Why? Because what we are actually introducing is supposed to be superior. Okay. And so on and so forth. So a few more slides. So what do you mean to bring all this together? Then sociolinguistics through a decolonial lens, therefore, so bringing things into perspective. So there is a need for us to have clarity of our political beliefs and practices and commitments, because these beliefs and practices and commitments are as important as the actual pedagogical strategies used in instruction. You know, when I toured, you know, Southeast Asia for a lot of workshops, a lot of trainings of teachers and students as well. All right. There's always this desire to know what are the best practices, what are the newest trends, for example, in the teaching of this particular language or that. You know, it's always the focus is always on pedagogical strategies. All right. But very, very little on what are our beliefs, what are our practices, what are our commitments, to society, for example, when we teach certain languages or when we teach certain subjects? Because as far as Trueba and Bartolome, and I myself included here, there are clarity. If we are clear about our own practices and why we do the things that we do, all right, they are as important as the how-to, pedagogy in our classroom. All right. In fact, I would go as far as saying that we should move away from always asking questions about how do we do this? How do we do this? So how do we do this? I think it's important to push ourselves away from it first and foremost and talk about, what are our practices? What are our language beliefs first and foremost? Because these beliefs drive our pedagogical strategies as well. So decolonization, in other words, is really an attitude of the mind. All right. We need to do some kind of a rethinking of many of the concepts, our attitudes, meaning how do we approach, our own teaching? How do we approach our own learning? Because decolonization, change has to start in us. In other words, change doesn't have to start from others. It has to start from us, in other words. And here, Komarava de Velu, basically saying it's taking control. All right. It doesn't have to be the teaching of English here, but any sort of research area that we have, it is almost always, our decolonial lens is about taking control of our practices and concepts and principles and theories instead of blindly following those of others. All right. We need to take control. We need to make decisions. So the example that I gave earlier about I'm a multilingual teacher of English, I'm taking control of the narrative. I'm taking control of the way by which I introduce myself. I give myself a show and share with you what my identity is, rather than just simply people telling me this is who I am. All right. So it's sociolinguistics or decolonial lens. It's turning away from the norm, all right, from expected or authorized thinking. There are what are authorized thinking processes in our respective fields, all right? This is, again, I'll end with this somehow, all right? This is what Foucault mentions, thinking otherwise. I think we need to get into the habit of thinking otherwise, all right? Because by not thinking otherwise, we continue to perpetuate and do the same thing again and again and again, the kinds of concepts that we have been using. And if you notice what I have been doing since the very start of my presentation, really is to think otherwise, to get us to think about another way of thinking about who we are as speakers of a particular language. So let me therefore introduce myself to you again. And this is my last slide, all right? Because this is how I would like to frame myself and my understanding of sociolinguistics. I am a multilingual speaker of English, all right? Notice here, I'm erasing that identity of non-nativeness, because that is not me. That is an imposition given to me by others, all right? And therefore, by other people telling me that I'm a native speaker, they have devalued me as a speaker of English. I don't want to go far into talking about to what extent have you been valued even financially or monetarily just because you are just a non-native speaker of English, all right? So here we need to make such choices. And I think our lenses, our concepts, we need to redefine them. We need to restructure them in order to work for these concepts to work for us, to elevate us, to affirm who we are as multilingual speakers, rather than devalue us as well. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to some conversations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ruani Tupas, for your presentation about sociolinguistics from a decolonial lens. Of course, this becomes additional knowledge for us, especially in looking at linguistic phenomena from a decolonial perspective. Yeah, we got a lot of, maybe some of us got new vocabularies, yeah, about multilingualism, word Englishes, native speakerism, and also thinking otherwise, as what Michel Foucault mentioned in your presentation. Okay, maybe now we go to the next session, which is the Q&A session. In this session, I will give an opportunity to participants who want to directly ask our invited speaker, directly ask Dr. Ruwani Tupas. I think, yeah, Pak Irham from University of Brunei Darussalam. He want to ask you directly. Pak Irham, are you still with us?
I'm here. Thank you, Pak Gwin. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Rani, for
Yeah.
very inspiring.
Hello.
Yeah, most welcome, Pak Irham. From
First of all, I would
University
like
of Brunei
to
Darussalam.
thank you. I happened to contact you to ask a paper from you on knowledge production. I'm very happy that you shared it with me. So I think again today I would like to ask some questions regarding that issue. So first, yeah, I'm very happy and very motivated and engaged with the dialogue and discussion you have talked about. So I was thinking when you mentioned about that English has been spread and pluralized, diversified, right? And so I was thinking, what does it could later mean, or how should we view that diversity and spread of English toward the idea or the context of English language teaching, English language education, or higher education institution, which aims to internationalize their university, by which later on mostly and often English become the norm of the language, where the student and teacher, for example, are pushed to publish and work in English, because without that English, it seems that those are not going to be legitimate at the end. So I think that my first question. Second, I would like to share with you about that concept of decolonial lens, which I think on native speakerism. So it has been a lot of paper and literature talking on English. I was wondering what will happen to other languages, for example, in terms of Arabic, because Arabic language seems that they don't. It seems that they don't have the concept of native speaker. Well, I'm not sure, but I think some colleague from Arabic department that can clarify it. When we talk about native speaker of Arabic, sometimes we refer to standard Arabic, which is
Sorry, Mr. Irham. We lost you. Are you still with us?
It's important to actually identify native speaker.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, Mr. Irham. I think we cannot hear your voice, Mr. Irham.
Yeah, although I think I pick up those two questions. So I think I can respond to them. Yes, that's right. Well, for the very first one, let me give you one example. You know, I think I mentioned earlier very briefly that I lived and taught actually in Singapore for 20 years. All right. The first was at the National University of Singapore. And then after that, I moved to the National Institute of Education, also in Singapore. And, you know, when I was part of, for several years, of the selection panel, for example, for staff at the National University of Singapore, because I work at the Center for English Language Communication, all right? One of our main agenda, or one of the main aims really, was to diversify the faculty, all right? We wanted our students to be able to listen to have access to teachers who have, who have different accents, who have different varieties, who produce different varieties of English, in other words, all right? All based on the idea that when we're talking about professional teaching competence, it is about being effective, all right? Beyond just simply what variety you are actually using, right? In other words, we did not subscribe to this whole idea that if a teacher speaks in this particular variety, automatically this teacher must be the preferred teacher. All right. We wanted to, in fact, our students to be in classes that give them access to different kinds of Englishes. Why? Very simple and very practical. When our English teachers, for example, in the national, I'm talking of the National University of Singapore here, when they actually move out of our classrooms and into their lectures in science, in engineering, in business, all right, they are listening to lecturers who speak a wide variety of Englishes, all right? And so if you only give them one variety, if you only give them to listen to one variety, they will be at a disadvantage, because at the end of it all, right, they have to pick up the content of their lectures. All right. And to be able to pick up the content of the lectures is for them to be able to listen to different sounds, to different accents, and so on and so forth. Now, part of making them listen, or giving them access to different varieties, of course, it's not just simply, just to get them to listen to these different varieties. Part of it is for them to have a more open attitude towards other people. We have to remember this, all right? Attitudes towards languages, attitudes towards varieties are actually attitudes towards people, all right? When we mock, when we laugh at how other people talk or use a particular language, we are actually not mocking the language. We are not mocking the variety or the accent. We are mocking the speakers of the language. All right. So there's far more, political and ideological and social consideration to, the embrace of the different varieties of English. All right. Precisely because even within the international or globalized universities, such as the National University of Singapore, all right, there is a need for openness to different cultures, and of course, for that matter, different varieties. Now, it is one thing, of course, to it is another thing to say, all right, so what am I going to teach my students as far as academic writing is concerned? Of course, I'm going to teach them academic writing in a way that will help them get published, right? That's a given. But do I tell them that, hey, this is superior and everything else isn't? It's different. That is the reason why, to me, it is additive pedagogy. I am not going to tell people this is standard English, and because this is the correct English and yours is wrong, all right? I'm not going to tell, because, for example, my children, they were all born in Singapore. Therefore, they speak, they have taken on, Singapore English as well. But they also speak Philippine English. They also speak British English. All right. And in a place such as London, for example, all right, where people think, this is the seat of British English. Actually, if you want to be a competent speaker of English, you need to be able to make switches, because more than half of the population in a place such as the UK, for example, especially London, all right, speak other languages other than English, and speak English that is not British, all right? So when you're talking about competence in English, we should not be talking about competence in British English. We're talking about competence in the way we negotiate English in real communication. All right? Because the moment we only give them access to one variety, all right, there's a sound somewhere. Okay, sorry. Because the moment we show them access to a certain variety, or give them access only to one variety, all right, we are putting them at a disadvantage in the global stage. Because in the global stage, in global, context of interaction, it's different languages, it's different varieties all coming together, all right? And to be able to, for them to be able to negotiate, all right, they must be able to, be having access to all these different varieties as well. Now, this is what Kanagaraja, Suraj Kanagaraja, meaning says something about, refers to as, competence is actually be able to switch between Englishes. All right. It's not so much about don't teach standard English, but the point is that are our students able to switch? That's where I think, to me, and it's in Singapore, that's how it is. Almost everybody speaks English, which is the colloquial language. All right. But those who are competent in English are those who are able to make the switch between Singlish and the standard, so to speak. Because if they cannot, that's where the problem is. So the problem is not Singlish. The problem is, the challenge is being able to make that switch. Now, going back, moving on to your second question about, native speaker. I'm not in a position to talk about, native speaker issues in the context of the teaching of Arabic. All right. But I guess the point here with native speakerism in English is exactly the fact that there's just so much negative value associated with being non-native speaker, such that when we assign ourselves this identity, automatically our value in the linguistic market is lower. Again, I keep on saying this in my other lectures. For example, my doctorate in English, my master's in English, all right, my having taught, the English language in all across, from basic English up to PhD level English, all right, all of these things, my more than 30 years of experience teaching the language, all of these things did not matter, all right, when I send my CV to a private institution of English in some place in Asia, because I will still be getting paid less than someone who looks like a native speaker, not necessarily, a graduate of education or a teaching of English, just any sort of college degree, but who speaks a particular variety of English coming, for example, from the United States. So that is native speakerism. Why? Because your experience is not counted. Why? Because the belief that automatically, when you're a so-called native speaker, you are automatically a better teacher. You're automatically a better speaker. I think the literature, the research literature shows us that that's not the case. All right. And so the important thing really is with this whole about native speakerism, in other words, is what are those negative values that are associated with, all right, who we are. All right. And that's what we need to destroy. That's what we need to demolish. Thank you.
Thank you. Pak Irham, do you still have any question or feedback? Or
thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Roni, for very excellent feedback.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Irham. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, do you still have any question for our invited speaker, for our speaker, Dr. Roni Tupas? You are most welcome. Maybe in commentary column. No, or maybe, maybe
I have a question. Excuse me.
Oh yeah, you are most welcome. Bu or Mrs. or Miss Parawati Siti Sondari. Okay,
Hello,
you are most
yeah.
welcome.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. Dr. Tupas, thank you for the talk. It's very inspiring. A little bit, sharing a little bit of my background. I teach in an English language teacher education program. So I teach pre-service teachers. And I've been going through a journey of shifting ideology or beliefs, pretty much everything that you mentioned, everything speaks to me. So I have a question about facilitating decolonial ideology work. I'm trying to promote, social justice in my language or teaching practices, but I'm still a bit confused on how to facilitate decolonial ideology work with pre-service teachers. I don't know if they see those practices in my practices, or do I have to do an explicit discussion with them? Do you have any experience regarding that matter? That's my only question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. In fact, a lot when I conduct workshops precisely on decolonizing language teaching, decolonizing social linguistics, for example, I emphasize, I think there's one towards the end of my lecture earlier, I emphasize really the importance of ideology and beliefs, all right? And so I explicitly tackle these concepts myself, because if I don't tackle them, all right, whatever it is that we tell them to do, things do not get clear, are not clear. I think, to me, when we talk about taking control over what we do in the classroom, we need first and foremost to take control of how we think about ourselves and how we think about English or any language for that matter. And when we are taking control of these concepts, for example, or these beliefs, things change in the mind, things change in the way we view things, for example. And that's when, I think there's the word there, that's when we trouble ourselves, and that's when we trouble our students, all right? And then that's when we then start exploring alternative ways of dealing with this, all right? For example, there is this guilty feeling usually among teachers, that when we use the first language, our own local language in the teaching of English, we feel like we are not helping our students, all right? Precisely because, language teaching methodology courses through the years, through the decades, have always taught us that only English must be in the language classroom, in the English language classroom, and only whatever it is that we're teaching, all right, must only be that in the classroom, all right? But on the first and foremost, empirically, that doesn't work. There's just very little, there's nothing much in the literature, in the research, that basically tells us that if you teach English through English only, it's superior, all right? The point here is that when given and confronted by the possibility that, like, there are certain issues, for example, in the classroom, where students do not understand a grammatical concept, all right, or do not understand a certain issue, whatever social issue it is, all right, do you allow them? Do you scaffold the learning, all right? For example, to the use of particular language, in order for them to get to a certain level where they can actually use English to be able to talk about it, all right? Because how is it possible for us, for example, to get them to engage in talking about a particular issue when they do not even understand the issue to start with, all right? So there has to be some kind of like scaffolding pedagogy that can involve multilingual resources, all right? The literature is very clear about this, though. It is called strategic or judicious. In other words, it is not, it doesn't tell us that, it's okay to use it anytime. It's okay to use it no, the literature is still very, very clear. strategic, and judicious. In other words, competent, highly effective teachers use multilingual resources in strategic, judicious way. In other words, if they see the need that it helps or facilitates learning, they will use it. All right. But why is it that we feel guilty using it? Because we have been colonially, brainwashed. So, sorry for the term, in workshops, in teacher training, in textbooks. A lot of these trainings basically tell us, that, we need to feel guilty for doing it. All right. It is one thing, however, I have to clarify this. It is one thing to be able to use all of these multilingual resources because you really don't know how to use English. That's something else, right? But to be able to use other languages, for example, or other cultural, multicultural resources as strategic pedagogical, acts in the classroom, that's part of competence. All right. So my point here, going back to you, is that if we do not get clarity, if our students are not clear about where this is coming from, why these requirements, why these norms, then they will continuously be doing what they are asked to do, precisely because they don't have any theoretical or political basis upon which to do it. So I think it's important to really surface these beliefs in the classroom, right? Because, again, the literature is clear about this. Whatever beliefs that our teachers have, whatever beliefs that we have, they always translate to practice, all right? So if that is the case, then somehow certain transformations in the way we think will also lead to transformations in what we do in the classroom. Right. Another thing also is this. We have been, this is my experience, not just in Indonesia, but also in the Philippines, where I'm from, in Vietnam. I've been to Vietnam so many times. Actually, also in Brunei Darussalam, in a project that I had, I visited Brunei Darussalam, even including the Language Institute there, right? University of Malaya, colleagues in Malaysia as well, and other parts of Southeast Asia. And the push, when we are engaging in issues, for example, in conversations about theory, about issues such as the ones what they are doing now, the push, the tendency always is, tell us what to do now. All right, it's always tell us what to do now. Now, for me, I refuse to do that. Because you see, at the end of it all, teachers must be given ownership over what to do. Except that, I think in training, in workshops, we have actually given ourselves and our teachers this whole belief that what they need is us telling them what to do. All right? That's why best practices, that's why, the most current approaches, the most recent ones, it's always like that. All right. But I think what is really most important is we need to engage ourselves in these questions, about concepts, thinking otherwise, in other words, can be a good approach to conversations in workshops, in teacher training. And then ask them, given these changes, what you think are possible in your classroom? What can you do? Because the moment they are committed to a particular concept, we can guarantee that they can also be committed to doing something about it in the classroom. Instead of, okay, so you do it now. But if you tell them we do it now, then there's no clarity as to why they're doing it or why they should be doing it. Then it becomes still, a chicken and egg kind of an issue, right? It doesn't address anything. If we need not tell them that these are the newest things. We have to somehow let them know that they can take control over their own classrooms. All right. And if we can do that, we actually can produce independent, teachers who can make decisions, within the conditions of their own classroom. You know, I mean, we all have our own restrictions, right? And that is what I keep on telling the teachers. You should know your own spaces. You should know what your own problems. So what we are here to talk about these issues. Let us think otherwise. But what to do? It's your choice. What to do? You should know your classroom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rwani Tufas. Yeah, is there any more question for our speaker? Pak Ribut, maybe you want to discuss something with Dr. Rwani Tupas?
Thank you, Pak Agwin, for the time given. Actually, I want to share an experience of teaching in the post-structuralism and deconstruction classroom, where I usually mobilize critical scholars' work. Usually, we introduce, for example, Foucault or Derrida from secondary sources, because if that's from the first sources, it's going to be difficult. The language is quite, challenging, but the secondary sources, okay. In my opinion, mobilizing these critical works by the secondary scholars are quite effective to, deconstruct the dominant understanding, for example, like native speakerism and also native speakerism, monolingual approach and something like that. But I also found a case where after students pass from the course and then they start writing a thesis, there is a case where students tend to go back again, when there is a case of student going back again to be trapped in the dominant thought. Yeah, they tend to write, in the spirit of monolingual tendency. So once they are thought about the critical works, then they tend to follow the critical thinking. I mean, the critical way of constructing knowledge. For example, they began to reject native speakerism and monolingual approach. But after passing the course, they tend to, one of the students tend to go back to again be trapped in monolingual tendency. This is interesting in the sense that the hegemony of monolingual approach is really there. It's really pervasive. So if currently we have Professor Van Leeuwen, for example, wrote a book on the limit of negotiation. I'm wondering whether Dr. Rwani Tupas has also such kind of experience. For example, teaching critical works to the students, and then they become, more critical, and then once they pass the course, and then they return again to be trapped in that kind of Western hegemonic native speakerism, and also something like that. Means that there is a limit of negotiation in that case. What do you think, Dr. Tupas?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so surprising, to be honest. All right, precisely because when you're talking about coloniality, all right, you're talking about ideas that were carried over, the practices that were carried over from generations, of education and generations of social practices that are monologic, monolingualist, native speakers in nature. And, I keep on telling, teachers, for example, and students that is the reason why, there's no one-shot deal to, a magic wand that basically changes people's practices, all right? There will always be people who will be able to resist this, all right? But I think the important point is, we continue to, plant the seeds of thinking otherwise, all right? what I usually emphasize is, and this is the point basically, at the end of the day, all right, our job is not to get them to do things the way we want them to do things. Our job is for them to take control over their decisions. All right. Why are they making decisions? Right. Because right now, for example, do they even have a choice? All right. Even myself, even ourselves, I am a non-native speaker of English. Do I even have a choice of representing myself in another way? All right. Because then if someone chooses to, to choose themselves in being a native speaker, then that's the choice. But they have that option, but at least they made that choice, other than having no choice at all. All right. So I think, to me, it's also problematic to be able to get them to expect them to really do exactly the same things that we want them to do. Now, I'll give you one example. In a project, a Temasek project, that I engaged in before. Actually, part of it would be some colleagues in and institutions in Indonesia, and of course Vietnam, and the Philippines, and Singapore. All right. Our approach was to start with a problem. All right. So we went around different institutions in Southeast Asia and asking them, so what do you think are your problems, in your respective classrooms? And let's start from these. All right. So we came up with these problems, and then up to the point of, designing, let's say, needs analysis projects, for example, until they started, interviewing people from the different industries as well. All right. And then bringing all of these data together in order to write their own materials. And then these materials get tested. These materials get tested by their own colleagues. We workshop these materials. We went from different places, from one institution to another, until such time that they revise these materials and use these materials, and eventually put them in their own, include them in their own curricula. All right. In the end, we were not sure whether these materials really were aligned with our own ideologies. But what is important is they went through a different process of basically finding out what to do with their own classrooms and with their own institutions. Instead of we come in and say, oh, you need a world Englishes paradigm. We need to change your mind about world Englishes and use them, all right, in your materials. You know how it is now, even in other, some of you are probably familiar. This is like an English as a lingua franca informed workshop. So it's, the idea always how to change people's minds about certain things, all right, and then get them to implement these things in their respective classroom. But I think the important point really is, when we are trying to decolonize knowledge production in our field, we don't start with, hey, our teachers need to be educated with these kinds of approaches and these kinds of new things in sociolinguistics. I think we need to go down to the ground and basically ask ourselves, what are our needs? What are your desires? All right. How do we go about addressing these problems? And then we start from there. All right. So the solutions that they come up with, they have taken control over it. All right. Instead of the solutions coming from the outside, which then eventually become meaningless to these teachers. So I think, to me, to go back to your question, I understand completely, and definitely that happens all the time in most of my workshops as well, and most of my training sessions. You don't get people to change their minds very easily, precisely because colonial thinking is internalized. If we change the way we think about certain things, in a sense, we actually change who we are. So if some students, like I had, like in Singapore, so many times, many students who changed, somehow cried, then had some sort of breakdown in the class, because it's about who they are. The moment you let go of your own beliefs and change them, you're letting go of your own practices. You're letting go of who you are, of who you think you are. And these are things that I think are very difficult to let go. And it takes time, basically. So for me, I'm not really bothered. We just continue doing what we need to do. Now, another thing also is um, because of the students and even the teachers, my way, because my work is on inequalities of multilingualism, my way of introducing these very important issues of social justice, issues of in coloniality, I don't go straight to the literature. I think probably you, Pak Ribut, you probably have seen me talk about P-pop, Filipino pop music, for example. I get, the teachers to watch, music videos that use different languages, Philippine languages, for example. I get them to watch and look at the comments and the conversations in the comments, for example, because when you actually look at these comments, these music videos, they actually become very relatable to the students. All right. So that's my entry point. That's my entry point to talking about all of these really big concepts, like multilingualism, like coloniality, and so on. Because somehow then they realize there's a connection to my everyday life. Our students are very concerned with different things that we don't even know already. We are not even aware of. I think one way is start where they are, start what they know with what they know. From there, they're interested in fashion, they're interested in music videos, they're interested in whatever music, not necessarily music, actually. They're interested in probably even sports. I don't know. But my point here is that there's so much there in these things that they are concerned with that you can actually draw from to talk about social justice, to talk about identity, to talk about gender, to talk about cultural or intercultural communication, and so on and so forth. So perhaps that's also one way to get them involved in these things. Perhaps they're too far from what we teaching them, when in fact it shouldn't be, because it's things that these are also everyday things that they are involved in. Thank you.
Unmute, Pak.
Thank you for your explanation, Dr. Ruanitupas. It reminds me of really post-structural works where we need to start from practice. Practice comes first, then we go back to literature to support for that practice. Pak Agwin, we have here, so I think some lectures or several lectures also here. We have also Professor Zulati Rohma, Pak Agwin. Maybe you can offer Bu Zuliati, maybe you are interested to ask a question or providing comments or sharing experience to us, Professor Zuliati.
Yeah, you are most welcome, Professor Zuliati.
Or if Bu Zuliati is not there, we can offer a chance for other participants to ask question or probably sharing their experience in teaching.
Pak Samsudin. Yeah, maybe Pak Samsudin.
Oh yeah, Pak Samsudin.
Yeah, Pak Samsudin.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to me, Pak Gwin, and also Pak Ribut.
Yeah, you're most welcome, sir.
Right. I thank you very much. Okay. I would like to ask especially about what I have already experienced in the process of teaching. Well, as we know that when we teach English, actually the main aims of our teaching English itself is making the student to be able to speak English. And I think I myself, I have already experienced it, especially when I teach speaking. And also another subject, say like in this semester, I teach the history of American literature. The question that I would like to ask, say, for example, in the teaching of speaking, well, probably in the speaking context, when we teach speaking, then when we have a discussion, whether it is in a kind of group discussion or class discussion, then we force our student to speak English. However, related to the ability of the student who are still in the process of learning English, then as lecturer, I usually gives a kind of flexibility for the students, say when they have group discussion and then when they have some difficulties to talk about the topic that they haven't known before, then it is possible for them to do a kind of code switching. What I mean here, they are going to change the code, the language, from English into the native language, especially using the Indonesian. Well, it seems that this method is working well because the main goal of me to use this strategy is that I want them to practice English without stopping speaking. So it is working, especially when I'm teaching speaking, because the context in this process of teaching speaking is that all of the students are practicing English and they have the same opportunity to use English as a means of communication, especially in the speaking subject. But it will be different when I teach another subject that is not speaking, especially it is about this semester, for example, the story of American literature. Well, sir, when I force my students, say, for example, when they have group presentation, in which in this group presentation, every group should present a topic, yeah, in front of the class. And I myself, I have forced my student to present the presentation in English. Actually, there is no problem with their presentation because I do believe that they have prepared themselves very, very well, so that almost every member in the group would be able to present the presentation well. But the problem then come when, especially when we have already come to the session question and answer. In the session question and answer, for example, in the last week topic, we have already discussed about romanticism in the history of American literature. Well, about the concept of romanticism, I think there is no problem with our student to talk about romanticism in the history of American literature. But the problem when it is about, say, the ability of speaking in terms of fluency, then there will be problem, especially when they have come further to the topic about romanticism, say, for example, to talk about some authors during romantic era in the history of American literature. Then when they have to talk to about the works, yeah, that have been produced by some American writers in the era of romantic era in the story of American literature, when they come further, then seems that to express those, say, explanation related to, say, some writers and also their works during the romantic era, they felt difficult to express their ideas in English. And at that time, my student asked permission to me, how if we use Indonesian language in terms of giving the explanation so that all of the students would be able to understand that explanation well. Well, this is the problem, sir. In one case, I want them to learn English by presenting a topic, yeah, using English as well as they can. But in other words, they feel difficult when they come to give a kind of explanation in terms of content of the subjects. Well, I'm in dilemma in that time, but because I try to understand their position, that they try to give a better understanding related to the topic that they want to present to the other students in the class, then I let them to use Indonesian. Although in this case, in my heart, I feel hard, but I have to do that too. Why? Because this is not about speaking class, but this is about content subject. That is, the student need to know about the history of American literature, especially when it is topic about romanticism or romantic era in the early in the history of American literature. So what your opinion about the strategy that I have already taken, sir? Especially I let the student to use Indonesian for the sake of understanding or clarity from the other students. Yeah, but at the same time, at that time, I feel guilty not being able to force my student to use English as a means of communication, as it is the main target of us when we teach English in the English department. Then we have to be able to force dalam tanda kutip to force our students, yeah, to use English as means of communication. Well, that's all that I would like to ask. I thank you for the answer, and Pak Akwin and also Pak Ariwut, I thank you for the opportunity given to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Samsudin, for the question based on his own experience while teaching history of English literature and also speaking at the same time. Okay,
Yeah.
Dr. Rwani Tupas, you are most welcome to answer the question from Pak Samsudin.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Shamsuddin. Well, I guess first and foremost, I think I don't think you need to feel guilty about it. You know, I think that's really these are realities in the classroom, so to speak. Right? I think first and foremost, I think we need to ask ourselves. I think you know that already, right? What is the main aim of the presentation, for example? Because at some point we may demand a lot from our students, but I think at this point what is probably most important is for them to understand the concepts, for them to be able to communicate and talk about certain aspects and certain issues in American literature. And I think, to me, being able to use the first language, Indonesian, is really not an issue. All right. And therefore, if you are able to accomplish that, because that is something like content, why not? Go ahead, right? It facilitates. Another thing also that I see is, I think pedagogically, all right, there are times when our expectations are over here, right? But our students are somewhere here, for example. All right. And so their level of proficiency, for example, all right, is somewhere here, and expectations are over here. So what can be done, for example, to bridge this gap? All right. So what I see, for example, is, I think pedagogically they are not yet there to be able to give us what we are actually expecting them. So perhaps, to me, what might be more pedagogically wise is to at least ask ourselves, how is it possible for us to bring our students from this level to this level? You see, because whatever it is that we do, we want them to bridge this one. But if their level is over here, it's never going to be going up. That's why we need the scaffolding. We need scaffolding. We need strategies that can help them bring them up slowly. So perhaps, since they cannot do this certain things, perhaps we need certain activities that can get them with talking about American literature in ways that can bring them up over here, all right, such that slowly they will bring themselves up there. That is, of course, the reality on the ground. All right. In the end, they may not be able to get to this point, but if we scaffold our pedagogy in such a way that we can actually increase and improve, their learning of a particular content up to this point, then I think we have already done our job. I think what happens is, because our expectations are here, all right, up here, and they didn't do as good as we would have wanted to, all right, then we feel guilty, then we feel bad because they haven't reached that point. Whereas if we try to change the way we look at things, that they are here, all right, and we were able to bring them up to this level, all right, because that is how much we can do in the class for one semester, then we are looking at ourselves as effective. You know, we are looking at how the students have accomplished a lot in class rather than bring them up, try to idealize the expectations, and we know that they can't at the moment. You get my point? So I think pedagogically, there has to be some kind of an adjustment in what we know and what we think about what our expectations are.
Okay.
That's a very good explanation from Dr. Ruwani Tupas. Pak Samsudin, do you have still a question or maybe an opinion to share, reacting
Right.
to Dr. Ruwani Tupas' answer?
Yeah, I think that's all, Pak Ribut.
Thank you for your questions, Pak Sam. I think Pak Akwin want to. Please, you should close this now.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Pak Ribut and also Pak Samsudin. All right, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, because we are also running out of time, the question from Mr. Samsudin also ended our Q&A session for this webinar. Yeah, well, we would like to say thanks again for Dr. Ruwani Tupas. And also I want to say thank you for all the audience for their active participation on this webinar. Thank you for your attention, and maybe without closing remarks. Thank you for your attention, and see you on the next webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruwani and other participants.
Thank you.
As well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.